Tasha had always believed that her life was shaped by purpose. As a successful project manager at a fast-paced tech company, she often found herself working late nights, navigating tight deadlines, and managing teams that spanned continents. The work was grueling, but rewarding. However, with Christmas just around the corner, Tasha had planned to take a break. She needed it. The stress of the past few months had taken its toll, and she was looking forward to a quiet, relaxing holiday with her family. She had been meticulously planning her holiday getaway for weeks. Her bags were packed, her itinerary neatly organized, and her mind set on reconnecting with her roots, spending time with her parents and younger siblings. The flight to her hometown, a small city in the heart of the Midwest, was supposed to be the perfect start to her time off. She was prepared for a smooth, uneventful journey that would offer a few moments of calm before the whirlwind of family reunions and celebrations began. The morning of her flight arrived with the usual rush of airport chaos. Tasha hurried through the bustling terminal, glancing at her watch. She had just enough time to grab a quick coffee before heading to her gate. She looked around, noticing the usual throng of travelers, some in a hurry, others lazily checking their phones or carrying on conversations. It felt like any other day at the airport, a blend of impatience, excitement, and quiet anticipation for the journey ahead. Boarding the plane, Tasha felt a wave of excitement wash over her. The thought of being home, sitting around the dinner table with her family, felt like a much-needed escape from the stresses of her career. The flight attendants, efficient and polite, greeted passengers as they made their way to their seats. Tasha's seat was in the middle section of the plane, nestled between a businessman in a suit who barely looked up from his laptop and a couple who appeared to be on their honeymoon. She quickly settled in, stowing her bag overhead and adjusting her seatbelt. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Tasha closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the engines, allowing herself a moment to relax. She had always found the sound of a plane taking off strangely comforting. It was a reminder that she was on her way to peace, to a break from the constant pressures of work and the relentless pace of life. But as the plane ascended into the clouds, something shifted. Tasha had never been one to get airsick, but today, she felt a tightness in her chest, a dizziness that seemed to wash over her in waves. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the mild discomfort that sometimes accompanied flights. However, as the minutes passed, the sensation grew stronger. Her chest felt heavy, and she struggled to take a deep breath. A slight tingling in her fingers made her wonder if she was just tired or dehydrated, but something in the back of her mind told her it was more than that. Tasha reached for the call button, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed it. She waited, watching the flight attendants move up and down the aisle, helping other passengers with their requests. She tried to ignore the growing discomfort, telling herself it would pass, but it didn't. Her breath became shallow, and her head felt light, like she was floating just above her body. A flight attendant finally approached her, smiling warmly as she asked, "How can I help you, miss?" "I'm feeling a little off," Tasha replied, trying to sound calm despite the growing panic in her chest. "I've been feeling dizzy, and I'm having trouble breathing." The flight attendant nodded, but the smile never left her face. "It's probably just the altitude. If you'd like, I can bring you some water." Tasha nodded gratefully, her throat dry as she tried to maintain her composure. "Yes, that would be great." As the flight attendant walked away to retrieve the water, Tasha leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes and focusing on steadying her breathing. But it wasn't helping. The tightness in her chest felt like an invisible weight pressing down on her ribs, making it harder to inhale. She could hear the hum of the plane, the voices of passengers around her, but none of it seemed to matter. She felt disconnected from everything, like she was trapped in her own body, unable to break free from the suffocating sensation. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned with a small plastic cup of water. "Here you go," she said, placing it on Tasha's tray table. "Take small sips. You should feel better soon." Tasha thanked her and tried to drink the water, but her hands were shaking too much to hold the cup steady. She was starting to feel more than just dizzy. It was like the room was spinning. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she struggled to keep her eyes focused on the flight attendant's face. "I don't think this is just altitude," Tasha said, her voice strained. "I'm not feeling better. I really need help." The flight attendant paused, looking at Tasha with a slight frown. "We're a little busy right now. If you'd like, I can inform the captain once we're able to get to a suitable altitude." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. Her mouth was dry, and she could barely summon the strength to speak. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I need help now." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing down the aisle at the other passengers, then back at Tasha. She seemed to weigh her options before offering a forced smile. "I'll check with the captain, but please try to stay calm. You'll be fine." Tasha watched her walk away, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. Something wasn't right. She had never felt this bad in her life, and the lack of urgency from the flight attendant made her feel more isolated than ever. Every instinct told her that this wasn't just a case of altitude sickness. Her body was telling her that something was wrong, and no one was listening. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as she waited. Every time she tried to take a deep breath, it felt like her lungs wouldn't expand enough to fill with air. Her fingers tingled, and she had to fight the urge to panic. She knew she needed help, but the flight attendants seemed more focused on the comfort of other passengers than on her life-or-death situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flight attendant returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. A man in a suit had joined her, a passenger who had been seated a few rows ahead. He was holding his chest, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The flight attendant quickly knelt beside him, offering assistance without hesitation. Tasha watched in disbelief. The man's condition seemed less urgent than hers, but he was receiving immediate attention. The flight attendant was asking him questions, checking his pulse, and offering him reassurance. Tasha's heart sank as she realized she was still being ignored. Her panic deepened. She wanted to shout, to demand that someone take her seriously, but all that came out was a weak cough. She reached for the call button again, but it felt pointless. The world around her felt distant, as though she was sinking into a fog. Her limbs were heavy, and she struggled to keep her eyes open. All she could think was, "Why isn't anyone helping me?" The minutes dragged on, and Tasha's hope of receiving aid dwindled. Her body felt like it was betraying her. She knew she couldn't wait much longer. Desperation gnawed at her insides, and she realized that she was no longer in control. She was at the mercy of the very people who had sworn an oath to ensure the safety of every passenger on board. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign flickered off, Tasha made a decision. She wouldn't wait any longer. She couldn't. She had to act. The time for being polite, for waiting for help, had passed. She needed it now. And she would not be ignored any longer. Tasha's heart raced as she felt a surge of adrenaline take over. The suffocating tightness in her chest had only worsened, and the room around her seemed to blur with every passing second. She couldn't breathe properly, and her vision had started to tunnel. She had always prided herself on being level-headed, on staying calm in even the most stressful situations. But this was different. This was life or death. She couldn't afford to wait any longer for help that might not come. Her fingers trembling, she pushed herself out of her seat, ignoring the sudden wave of dizziness that nearly knocked her off balance. She felt as if her legs were made of lead, but somehow, she managed to stand. The movement felt unnatural, as if her body was no longer responding the way it should. But there was no turning back now. She had to make her presence known. She had to make them listen. As she staggered down the aisle, she could see the flight attendants talking in hushed tones, still focused on the man in the suit who had somehow captured their attention. The whole scene felt surreal to Tasha. She felt like an invisible ghost, someone whose life was worth less than that of the man who had asked for help. The moment it hit her, the injustice felt like a slap to the face. How could they not see her pain? How could they ignore her desperate need for help? Her breathing grew more shallow, and her chest tightened painfully. She could feel her legs trembling, but she pushed forward, determined not to give up. She was close now, just a few feet away from the flight attendants. Without hesitation, she reached out and tapped the nearest flight attendant on the shoulder. The woman turned around, her face softening for a moment as she noticed Tasha's distress. "Ma'am, I really need help," Tasha gasped, her voice hoarse. "I can't breathe. I'm not feeling well." The flight attendant's eyes flickered with something resembling annoyance, as if she were inconvenienced by Tasha's request. "I told you before, it's just the altitude. You'll be fine. Please, sit down." But Tasha wasn't having it anymore. She couldn't sit back down and risk losing control. She felt like she was slipping, like everything around her was starting to crumble, and she couldn't allow herself to go unnoticed any longer. Her voice came out louder, sharper. "No. This is serious. I'm not just dizzy, I'm suffocating. Please, please, help me." The flight attendant's eyes darted nervously between Tasha and the man in the suit, who had now started to sit up, his condition seemingly improving under their attention. With a sigh, she looked at Tasha and then at her colleague across the aisle, who had been dealing with the situation involving the man. "I'll tell the captain, but I really need you to calm down. You're making a scene." The words felt like a slap, colder and more dismissive than anything Tasha had expected. She was making a scene. She wasn't making a scene, she was fighting for her life. The injustice of it all hit her like a wave, and she had to fight the urge to cry. With every inch of strength she could muster, she gripped the back of a nearby seat for support, trying to steady herself. The world was spinning around her now, her breath coming in short gasps, and she could feel the panic setting in. How much longer would she have to beg for their attention? Her body was screaming at her to do something, anything, but the suffocating feeling was growing worse by the second. In that moment, something inside of her clicked. The powerlessness, the helplessness, all of it. It was unbearable. She had been treated like an afterthought by the very people she'd trusted to ensure her safety. But no more. Tasha wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for someone to decide that she was worth their time. She wasn't going to let this be the moment she faded into the background, invisible, ignored, forgotten. With a sudden burst of energy, she pushed herself forward, ignoring the pain and dizziness. She made her way to the cockpit. She had no idea what she would say when she reached the door, but she couldn't wait any longer. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the handle, but her mind was focused. This wasn't a choice anymore, it was a matter of survival. When the door to the cockpit opened, the pilot and co-pilot both looked at her in shock. They hadn't expected anyone to come charging toward them like this. Tasha's vision was fading fast, and her strength was waning with every step, but she didn't care. "I need help," she said, her voice raw. "I'm not okay. I can't breathe. Please." For a moment, the two pilots looked at each other, exchanging confused glances. But it didn't take long for the urgency to hit them, for the gravity of the situation to become clear. One of the pilots immediately stood up and made his way toward the intercom. "This is the captain speaking. We have a medical emergency on board. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain calm. We are descending for an emergency landing." As the words echoed through the cabin, the passengers stirred. The sudden announcement caused a flurry of movement. Tasha felt herself sag, her legs giving way as her body finally succumbed to exhaustion. A few passengers rushed over to help, but she could barely hold herself up. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the aisle, her head spinning, her vision blurring to black. The last thing she remembered before everything went dark was the sound of the flight attendants' frantic voices and the sensation of being lifted from the floor, of hands touching her arms, pulling her up, and carrying her toward the back of the plane. She barely registered the plane's descent, the rush of air pressure that followed, but what she knew, what she was certain of, was that the help she had begged for, fought for, had finally arrived. When she woke up, she was no longer on the plane. She was in a small, sterile hospital room, hooked up to oxygen, with an IV in her arm. Her body felt weak, drained, but the sense of relief was overwhelming. She was alive. She had made it. The door to her room opened, and a nurse walked in, giving her a sympathetic smile. "You're lucky," she said softly. "We almost lost you." Tasha could hardly process the words. Her head was still foggy, and the exhaustion from the ordeal had settled deep in her bones. But the truth of it, the truth of what had almost happened, was sinking in. She had been moments away from losing everything. And for what? Because the flight attendants had brushed her off. Because no one had believed her when she said something was wrong. She had fought for her life, and she had won. But the price had been steep. The nurse continued, "They found a serious issue with your heart. It was a close call, but you'll be okay. You just need some time to rest." Tasha nodded weakly, her mind reeling. She had never expected anything like this. She had been so focused on getting to her destination, on escaping the pressures of her work, that she hadn't realized how fragile her health truly was. She had thought she was invincible, but now she understood how easily things could slip out of control. As she lay there in the sterile hospital room, the events of the flight played over and over in her mind. She thought about how she had been dismissed, how she had been ignored, and how close she had come to losing it all. She thought about the passengers who had looked at her like she was overreacting, the flight attendants who had refused to take her seriously, and the terrifying moment when she realized that no one was coming to help. The system had failed her, and she had fought against it with everything she had. Tasha had learned a painful lesson that day. No one should ever have to beg for their life to be taken seriously. And no one, no matter their race or status, should ever be dismissed when they're in need of help. The truth had never been clearer to her: we are all vulnerable, and the systems that are supposed to protect us don't always work in our favor. But in the end, it's up to us to fight for our own survival, no matter the cost. Tasha's eyes slowly fluttered open, but the world around her still seemed to swim in and out of focus. Her body felt heavy, as though the ordeal had drained every ounce of energy from her. The sterile scent of the hospital room, combined with the beeping sound of machines and the faint murmur of voices outside, made it clear that she was no longer on the plane. She was safe, for now. But the weight of what had happened lingered, and a sick feeling gnawed at her insides. The events of the flight flooded back to her. She remembered the terrifying moment when her breath had become shallow, her heart pounding in her chest as the walls seemed to close in. She remembered the dismissive attitude of the flight attendants, their reluctance to take her seriously. She had begged for help, pleaded with them to listen, but they hadn't. They hadn't heard her, hadn't believed her. And now, here she was, in a hospital bed, alive only because she had fought through the overwhelming fear and desperation to make her voice heard. But the fear remained, curling up inside her, making her question how many others had been ignored, dismissed, or forgotten. How many others hadn't made it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door. A nurse stepped in, her gentle smile offering a semblance of comfort. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice calm and soothing. Tasha blinked, trying to focus on the woman's face. The nurse's words seemed distant, as though she were underwater. She tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, and the words caught in her chest. After a moment, she managed to croak out a response, her voice weak but determined. I'm alive. I guess that's something." The nurse nodded, her expression sympathetic. "You're lucky. You were moments away from a heart attack. Your body had been under a lot of stress. But you're stable now." Tasha tried to process the nurse's words, but her mind was still foggy, still reeling from the shock of it all. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her. She had always been the picture of health, strong, capable, independent. She had built her life on the belief that she could handle anything, that she could overcome any obstacle. But this? This had shaken her to the core. The nurse adjusted the four in her arm and checked the monitors before sitting down next to the bed. "The captain from your flight called. He wanted to make sure you were okay," she said softly. Tasha frowned. "The captain?" "Yes. He and the crew were concerned about you. They wanted to make sure you were getting the care you need." Tasha's chest tightened at the thought of the captain and the flight attendants. Despite their earlier disregard, they had apparently realized the severity of the situation too late. She couldn't decide whether to feel grateful for their sudden concern or angry at their negligence. "Thank you," Tasha said, her voice raw. "But it's too late for that. They should have helped me when I needed it. They should have believed me when I said something was wrong." The nurse's expression softened, and she gave a small, empathetic nod. "I understand. But you're here now. You're safe. That's what matters." Tasha didn't know if she could accept that, though. How many others had been in her shoes? How many had been dismissed, ignored, and left to fend for themselves? How many had suffered in silence, unheard and unseen? She couldn't stop the questions from swirling in her mind. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, and she instinctively reached for it, though her fingers were still unsteady. A text message from her best friend, Candace, appeared on the screen. "Are you okay? I heard what happened. What do you need?" Tasha's heart sank as she read the words. Candace had been her rock, her confidant. But Tasha hadn't had the chance to reach out to her during the flight. She hadn't had time. The fear, the panic, it had all happened so quickly. Now, she felt guilty for not being able to share what had been happening in real time. She didn't want to worry her friend. But it was clear that the situation had shaken her, too. "I'm okay, I guess. I don't really know. Just scared. A lot of things went wrong." Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. "I'm so sorry, Tasha. I can't believe this happened to you. But I'm so glad you're alive." Tasha couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as she read the message. She was alive. She had survived, but at what cost? She couldn't forget the helplessness she had felt in those moments. The frustration. The disbelief. How many people had been in situations like hers, only to face consequences far worse than she could imagine? Her phone buzzed once more, this time with a news notification. "Passenger in medical distress forces emergency landing, crew under scrutiny." Tasha's stomach churned as she read the headline. She didn't know whether to feel angry or vindicated. Part of her wanted to see those who had ignored her held accountable. Another part of her wanted to forget about it all, to move on and never look back. But she knew that wasn't possible. She couldn't just forget what had happened, not after everything. The nurse left the room to check on another patient, and Tasha was left alone with her thoughts. The stillness in the room felt suffocating, and the weight of everything that had happened crashed down on her once again. She couldn't escape the images of the flight, of the moment when she had realized she wasn't going to get the help she needed. She couldn't escape the feeling of being invisible, of being dismissed by people who were supposed to protect her. The frustration, the anger, the helplessness, they all swirled together inside her. She had always been the one who took care of others, the one who stayed strong for everyone else. But now? Now, she had been the one in need, the one who had been left to fight for herself. The thought of it made her heart ache. But as she lay there, she couldn't ignore the spark of something else, something stronger than the anger. It was determination. A fierce need to ensure that no one else would ever be treated the way she had been. She didn't know how she would do it, but she knew she had to. She had to make sure that people would be held accountable for their actions. She had to make sure that others would never have to go through what she had experienced. And so, Tasha made a promise to herself that day, a promise to never stay silent, to never be ignored, to fight for what was right. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: she would never let anyone dismiss her again. She would speak up, and she would make sure her voice was heard. No one would ever have the power to silence her again. Tasha sat up slowly, her muscles still aching from the ordeal. The hospital bed felt foreign and uncomfortable, but her mind was far from resting. She was lost in thought, replaying the events of the flight over and over again. The panic she had felt, the disbelief when the flight attendants had refused to help, the crushing realization that she was alone in this. It all swirled in her mind like a storm that refused to settle. But something was different now. She wasn't going to let this go. She had made a vow to herself, and she intended to keep it. After a long stretch of silence, her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Candace. Tasha hesitated for a moment before answering. She hadn't spoken to her since the incident, and part of her felt guilty for not reaching out sooner. But the other part of her was just too shaken to put the experience into words. How do you explain to someone that you were ignored in your time of need? How do you explain that the people who were supposed to protect you not only failed but dismissed your distress entirely? Tasha? Candace's voice came through the phone, full of concern. Are you okay? I've been so worried about you. Tasha took a deep breath. I'm alive, she said quietly. But I don't know how okay I am. This whole thing, it's been a lot. I can only imagine, Candace responded sympathetically. I saw the news, and I can't believe it. I'm so glad you're okay, but I can't stop thinking about what happened. How could they just ignore you like that? Tasha closed her eyes, leaning back against the pillows. She had been asking herself the same question ever since the incident. How could they just stand there, watching her struggle, without even attempting to help? It didn't make sense to her. But she knew it wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, something that touched on all the things she had spent her life believing in: justice, fairness, and the protection of every person's rights, no matter who they were. I don't know, Candace, Tasha replied, her voice thick with emotion. It's like I wasn't even seen. Like, I didn't matter enough to be taken seriously. They just thought I was making it up or exaggerating. It's infuriating. Of course it is, Candace said softly. But you're here, you're alive, and you're strong. You don't have to let them win. You've been through so much already, and I know you're not the type to just let this slide. You've got a lot of people who care about you, Tasha. We all want to see you get through this and hold them accountable. Tasha was silent for a long moment, her thoughts running wild. Candace was right. She wasn't the type to let things slide, not when something was so obviously wrong. She had always fought for what was right, always stood up when others couldn't. But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just a small injustice. It was a deep, systemic failure, one that affected far more than just her. I'm not letting it go, Candace, Tasha finally said, her voice firm. I don't care how long it takes. They can't just treat people like that and get away with it. I'm going to make sure they answer for what they did. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been ignored or dismissed. Candace was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was full of conviction. I'm with you, Tasha. Whatever you need, you've got it. Tasha's heart swelled with gratitude. She had always known that Candace was her rock, but hearing those words made everything feel a little bit easier. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But with Candace and the support of others behind her, she felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could change things. That evening, Tasha found herself in front of her laptop, researching everything she could about the airline, the crew members, the policies in place for medical emergencies on planes, and the laws regarding passenger treatment. She wasn't just going to file a complaint and hope for the best. No, she was going to make sure this incident was investigated thoroughly. She was going to gather all the evidence she could, create a record of everything that had happened, and make sure that everyone involved was held accountable. As she sifted through the information, she came across dozens of stories from other passengers who had been in similar situations, people who had been dismissed, ignored, and brushed aside. Some had even suffered serious medical events, only to be left without help. It was shocking, but also incredibly validating. Tasha wasn't alone. This was a bigger issue, a systemic failure that needed to be addressed. Her phone buzzed again, and she saw that it was her lawyer. She had reached out to him earlier that day to discuss her options. He had been understanding and professional, and had assured her that he would help her navigate through the legal side of things. As soon as she answered, he got straight to the point. "Tasha, I've been looking over the information you sent me," he said, his voice steady and calm. "What happened to you is a clear violation of your rights as a passenger. I've already reached out to some experts in aviation law, and I think we have a good case here. But I need you to be prepared for the fact that this is going to be a long process." Tasha felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had expected it to be a long road, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Still, she couldn't let herself back down now. "I'm ready," she said, her voice strong. "I won't stop until this is addressed." The conversation continued as her lawyer explained the next steps in the process. They would need to file a formal complaint, gather statements from the crew and other passengers, and possibly even pursue legal action if the airline didn't take the matter seriously. It sounded like a long and complicated process, but Tasha was determined. She wasn't going to let them get away with what they had done to her, or what they had done to everyone else who had been ignored before her. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and paperwork. Tasha found herself reliving the events of the flight over and over again as she pieced together the timeline and gathered as much evidence as she could. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but she couldn't stop. Every time she thought about giving up, she remembered how it had felt to be dismissed, to be treated like her pain didn't matter. She remembered the fear that had gripped her when the flight attendants refused to help. She couldn't let that happen to anyone else. As the days went by, the news of her incident began to spread. More and more people reached out to her, sharing their own stories of being mistreated on flights, of being dismissed, ignored, and belittled. Tasha couldn't believe how many people had experienced the same thing. She realized then that this wasn't just about her, this was about something much bigger. It was about the treatment of people in vulnerable situations. It was about the way that some systems and people treated others as less than human. Her story went viral, shared by countless news outlets, blogs, and social media posts. People were angry, outraged by what had happened, and they rallied behind her. Tasha's inbox was flooded with messages of support from people all over the world. They were behind her. They wanted to see change. And that gave her the strength to keep pushing. But even as the public support grew, there were those who tried to discredit her, those who claimed that she was exaggerating, that she was seeking attention. It didn't surprise her, but it stung nonetheless. The airline issued a statement, offering an apology and promising to review their procedures, but Tasha knew it wasn't enough. She knew that words meant little without action. She wouldn't settle for just an apology. As she sat down to review the letters from passengers who had witnessed the incident, something clicked in her mind. This wasn't just about one flight, one incident, it was about the systemic disregard for passenger safety and well-being. It was about the failure of so many to recognize the humanity of others. And Tasha was determined to make sure that people saw the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. She wasn't just going to fight for herself. She was going to fight for all of them, the people who had been treated like they didn't matter, the people who had been silenced by those in power. And this fight was just beginning. As the weeks passed, Tasha felt both the weight and the empowerment of the responsibility she had taken on. The media frenzy over her incident had not subsided. In fact, it was growing. Every day brought new developments, new reactions, new interviews, and new faces. It felt like an avalanche, an endless wave of pressure crashing down on her, but she couldn't back down. The world was watching, and it wasn't just her story now, it was the story of thousands of others who had been ignored, pushed aside, or belittled for far too long. She had become their voice, and she could not afford to let them down. The scrutiny wasn't only from the public. The airline was not taking her legal battle lightly. Their lawyers had become more aggressive, their tactics more calculated. They had already offered her a settlement, and when she refused, they began to twist the narrative, portraying her as the aggressor, as if she had been the one to cause the disruption, the one to escalate the situation. It was a battle of narratives now, and they were doing everything in their power to paint her as the villain. But Tasha was determined not to let that happen. Every piece of misinformation was another reason to fight, another reason to make sure the truth was heard. One evening, after a particularly grueling round of interviews, Tasha sat in her living room, staring at her phone. There was a new headline flashing across the screen: Woman's claims of mistreatment on plane rejected by experts, airline denies allegations. Her heart sank as she read through the article. The experts quoted in the piece were dismissive of her experience, claiming that there was no real proof of discrimination or wrongdoing. The airline, of course, denied any malfeasance, claiming that they were simply following protocol and that Tasha was misunderstanding the situation. It was the same playbook they had used in the past. Discredit, deflect, distract. But Tasha knew better. She had been there, in that moment, in that seat. She had felt the cold indifference from the flight attendants, heard the dismissive tone of the captain. She knew exactly what had happened, and no amount of expert opinions or corporate spin was going to change that. She put the phone down and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The weight of the battle seemed even heavier tonight. She was tired. Tired of explaining herself, tired of fighting against a system that was determined to bury the truth. She had no idea how much longer she could keep this up. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She stood up and opened the door to find Candace standing there, a concerned look on her face. "Hey, I brought you some dinner," Candace said softly, holding out a bag of takeout. "I figured you might need a break." Tasha smiled gratefully, stepping aside to let her in. "Thanks, Candace. I could really use a break right now. It's been a rough day." Candace set the bag down on the kitchen counter and turned to her friend. "I know, I saw the article. I'm sorry, Tasha. People are they're never going to get it. They'll never understand unless they were in your shoes." Tasha nodded, feeling the weight of Candace's words. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. It's exhausting. Every day, it's the same thing, more headlines, more accusations, more interviews. And none of it is making a difference. The airline just keeps denying everything. It feels like I'm screaming into the void." Candace sat down beside her, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not screaming into the void, Tasha. You're making noise. You're changing things. People are listening. Maybe it doesn't feel like it right now, but you've already started something. You're already making an impact. You don't have to fix everything overnight." Tasha looked at her friend, a mixture of gratitude and frustration in her eyes. I just wish it was enough, you know? I wish I could make them understand. But it's like they don't care. They're just protecting their image, their profits, and it feels like we're just pawns in their game." Candace reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Tasha's. "They can't win. They might try to control the narrative, but the truth will come out. And you'll be the one to make sure of it. People like you, people who speak up, they change things. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Tasha let her words sink in. She knew Candace was right. This wasn't about immediate results. This wasn't about the headlines that day or the court rulings of the moment. This was a long fight, a battle that was bigger than any one person. It was about the future where people like her, people who had been denied dignity, would no longer have to fight for recognition. It was about a world where justice wasn't just a privilege for the powerful, but a right for everyone. That night, as they ate dinner together, Tasha's mind raced. She knew the next phase of her fight was going to be even harder. The public scrutiny, the legal battles, the emotional toll, it was all mounting. But as she sat there with her friend, eating a meal that was more than just food, it was a gesture of care, a moment of normalcy in the chaos, she found a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't doing this alone. She had people who supported her, who believed in her, and who were willing to stand by her side. She couldn't let them down. The next morning, she woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She had a meeting scheduled with her lawyer, and they were preparing for the next phase of the legal battle. The airline had refused to settle, and the case was heading to court. The pressure was mounting, but so was her resolve. This wasn't just about the flight incident anymore. It was about every person who had ever been denied help, every person who had ever been told that their voice didn't matter. It was about proving that people like her mattered, that their experiences were valid, and that they deserved to be treated with dignity. As the trial date neared, the tension in Tasha's life reached its peak. Every conversation felt heavier, every decision felt more significant. She couldn't afford to make a misstep, and the weight of that pressure was starting to wear on her. The media was still circling, waiting for every development, every twist in the case. But despite the constant barrage of stress, she held on to the one thing that had kept her grounded through it all, the truth. Her lawyer's office was bustling when she arrived for her meeting. The team had been preparing tirelessly, reviewing every detail of the case. They had found evidence, witnesses, flight records, and documentation that pointed to clear mishandling of the situation. But it wasn't just about the facts. This was about the story. Tasha's story. Her lawyer looked up as she walked in, offering a small smile of reassurance. "We're ready, Tasha," he said, his voice firm. "We've got everything we need to take this to court. It's time." Tasha nodded. She had fought for this moment. She had fought for the truth to come out, for justice to be served. And now, as she prepared for the next phase of her battle, she knew one thing for certain: she would not stop fighting until she had won. Until the truth had been heard and the system had been held accountable. She walked out of that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. There was no turning back now. It wasn't just about the plane incident anymore. This was a fight for change, a fight for a world where everyone was treated with dignity, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from. And Tasha was ready for the battle ahead. The courtroom was eerily silent as the proceedings began. The tension in the air was palpable, and every eye in the room was on Tasha. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a defining moment, not just for her, but for the countless others who had endured similar injustices, whose voices had been silenced. The stakes had never been higher. Tasha took a deep breath, trying to steady the nervous energy coursing through her. She glanced at her lawyer, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was the fight of so many people who had been wronged, their dignity trampled on by an indifferent system. The prosecution had laid out their case, presenting the airline's official narrative, one that painted her as an aggressive passenger who had caused unnecessary chaos. They had done everything in their power to discredit her, to shift the blame, and make her seem like the villain. But Tasha wasn't just going to sit back and let that happen. She was ready. She had lived through the ordeal, and she wasn't about to let anyone erase her truth. The truth of what had happened in that plane, the emotional toll it had taken on her, and the way it had sparked a chain reaction of courage in others. She had to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced in the face of injustice. When it was her turn to speak, Tasha stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt like it echoed through the room. She cleared her throat, feeling the weight of the eyes on her. For a moment, everything felt frozen. But then, she began to speak. "I'm not here to make anyone feel sorry for me," she started, her voice steady but strong. "I'm here because I believe in the truth. I believe in what's right. What happened to me on that plane was wrong, but what's even more wrong is that so many people think it's okay to treat others like they don't matter. They think it's okay to ignore someone in need, to brush them off as if their life doesn't count. But it does." Tasha's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, there was silence in the courtroom, as if everyone were holding their breath. She continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "People like me, people of color, people who don't always fit the mold of what society expects, are often treated like we don't deserve help, like we're not worthy of basic human decency. I've lived that. I've experienced that. And I'm not the only one. There are countless others who've faced the same thing, who've been ignored, brushed aside, or even belittled for something as simple as asking for help. But I'm here to tell you that it's not right. No one deserves to be treated that way. And we have to stand up and say enough is enough." Her words reverberated through the room, the weight of them settling into the hearts of everyone present. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for everyone who had ever been dismissed, disregarded, or told their voice didn't matter. The truth was on her side, and she was going to make sure it was heard. Tasha's lawyer stood up, following her lead. He had been working tirelessly to prepare for this moment, and now, it was time to present the evidence that would turn the tide in their favor. The witnesses who had stepped forward to testify on her behalf had already made a significant impact, confirming the details of her account and supporting her version of events. But now, it was time for the final blow, the proof that the airline had been willfully negligent, that their actions had not only been unethical, but illegal. The courtroom watched in rapt attention as Tasha's lawyer presented the evidence. Flight records, witness testimonies, and key pieces of documentation painted a clear picture of the airline's mishandling of the situation. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate effort to ignore a passenger in need, to deny her the help she deserved, all because of her race and gender. The evidence was undeniable. The airline had failed in its duty to protect its passengers, and it had to be held accountable. As the day stretched on, Tasha found herself lost in the weight of it all. She had never imagined she'd be here, standing in a courtroom, fighting not just for justice for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated in the name of corporate greed or prejudice. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but it was necessary. She had come too far to turn back now. The pieces were falling into place, and there was no going back. The closing arguments were made, and then, it was time for the jury to deliberate. The room buzzed with tension as everyone waited, not knowing how long it would take for a verdict to be reached. Tasha sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing. The courtroom was filled with an undercurrent of anticipation, but the air was thick with uncertainty. What if the jury didn't believe her? What if all of this had been for nothing? But deep down, Tasha knew she had done everything she could. She had stood up, she had spoken her truth, and now it was in the hands of the jury. Whatever the outcome, she had made a difference. She had opened the door for conversations that needed to happen, for awareness that had to be raised. The truth had been laid bare, and now, all she could do was wait. The wait felt like an eternity. Every minute stretched on for what seemed like hours. Then, finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jury filed back into the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. The judge called the court to order, and the foreman of the jury stood up to deliver the verdict. "Your Honor, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Tasha Daniels," the foreman said, his voice firm. "We find that the airline's actions were negligent and discriminatory, and they are hereby ordered to compensate the plaintiff for damages." A wave of relief swept over Tasha, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe it. After all the struggles, the doubts, the fear, the tears, she had won. The airline was being held accountable, and her story was validated. The truth had prevailed. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Tasha barely heard it. She was still processing the enormity of the moment. She had done it. She had stood up, and now, she had won. It was a victory not just for her, but for every person who had been mistreated, every person who had faced injustice, every person who had ever felt voiceless. As she walked out of the courtroom, her heart was light, the weight of the battle finally beginning to lift. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, that there would still be challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt hopeful. She had proven that one person's voice, when spoken with conviction and courage, could make a difference. She had changed the narrative, and in doing so, had changed herself. And as she walked out into the world, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but with every step, with every voice raised in solidarity, change was coming. And Tasha would be there, leading the charge.